Hey everybody, you're listening to Getting Out of the Machine. My name is Henry Bingaman. Now, I told you when I started this podcast that I was going to have some experimentation with the different types of episodes I do. And this is going to be one of those weeks. I was a little under the weather, so I had to push off some of the interviews I have planned. Although I have 3 great interviews coming up the next few weeks, so be sure to tune into those. But this week, I want to review an article called The Demoralized Mind by John F. Schumaker. Schumaker? I'm not sure exactly how he pronounces his name. One of the things that I think about a lot is how did we get to the position we're in society? It seems like over the past few years, the world has gone a little crazy. Before COVID, it was the Trump hysteria. But even before that, this article was published in April of 2016, so that's before Trump ever got the nomination. And we're going to hear a lot of, somewhat disturbing facts in this article that predate any of the political nonsense. I think our current political state is a symptom of something much bigger. It's a problem of purposelessness in the lives of so many Americans and people across the Western world, especially. So let me read this article to you, and I'll stop and make comments here and there. Our descent into the age of depression seems unstoppable. 3 decades ago, the average age for the first onset of depression was 30. Today, it is 14. Researchers such as Stephen Izzard at Duke University point out that the rate of depression in Western industrialized societies is doubling with each successive generational cohort. At this pace, over 50% of our younger generation, aged 18 to 29, will succumb to it by middle age. Extrapolating one generation further, we arrive at the dire conclusion that virtually everyone will fall prey to depression. Now, that alone is a scary number to think about. 50% of our younger generation right now will succumb to depression by middle age. And I don't know that you can actually extrapolate the way they do, but it's a scary number nonetheless. So what's causing all of this? Let's keep reading. By contrast to many traditional cultures that lack depression entirely, or even a word for it, Western consumer culture is certainly depression-prone. But depression is so much a part of our vocabulary that the word itself has come to describe mental states that should be understood differently. In fact, when people with a diagnosis of depression are examined more closely, the majority do not actually fit that diagnosis. In the largest study of its kind, Raman Mojabi of Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health sampled over 5,600 cases and found that only 38% of them met the criteria for depression. So that's an interesting tidbit right there, that only 38% of people that are diagnosed with depression are actually depressed. And that, I think, is the crux of this article, which is why I wanted to share it with you today. Contributing to the confusion is the equally insidious epidemic of demoralization that also afflicts modern culture. Since it shares some symptoms with depression, demoralization tends to be mislabeled and treated as if it were depression. A major reason for the poor 28% success rate of antidepressant drugs is that a high percentage of depression cases are actually demoralization, a condition unresponsive to drugs. Which makes sense to me. We have over-medicalized a lot of issues in this country. People lacking purpose in their life can't be treated with a drug. There's so much more that you need to do. This is why people that join a gym and start exercising often respond well, or often alleviate a lot of their depression, because it's not actually depression. It's a sense of momentum that you get from doing those activities, from getting healthier, from seeing your life improve, that overcome the underlying condition of demoralization in this case. If you're actually depressed, maybe there are some chemical imbalances, but again, only 28% of people respond to antidepressant drugs, a stat that in and of itself is kind of depressing. So let's keep going. In the past, our understanding of demoralization was limited to a specific extreme situations, such as debilitating physical injury, terminal illness, prisoner of war camps, or anti-morale military tactics. But there's also a cultural variety that can express itself more subtly and develop behind the scenes of normal everyday life under pathological cultural conditions such as we have today. This culturally generated demoralization is nearly impossible to avoid for the modern consumer. And consumer there is in quotation marks. The focus on consumerism, I think, is the main problem with this article. but the statistics and the underlying diagnosis I don't think is wrong. So, rather than a depressive disorder, demoralization is a type of existential disorder associated with the breakdown of a person's cognitive map. It is an overarching psycho-spiritual crisis in which victims feel generally disoriented and unable to locate meaning, purpose, or a source of need fulfillment. The world loses its credibility, and former beliefs and convictions dissolve into doubt, uncertainty, and loss of direction. Frustration, anger, and bitterness are usual accompaniments, as well as an underlying sense of being part of a lost cause or losing battle. The label existential depression is not appropriate since, unlike most forms of depression, demoralization is a realistic response to circumstances impinging on the person's life. Now, we're just a few days out from the, I don't know if you want to call it a crappy assassination attempt on Justice Brett Kavanaugh. And if you listen to what the guy that ended up turning himself into police said, is he wanted his life to have a bigger purpose. He is essentially a frustrated young man who didn't see any purpose in life and felt that, his cognitive map is an interesting phrase. It wasn't matching up to reality. In his worldview, the Supreme Court is taking away rights from women. And he wanted to give his life purpose by literally assassinating a Supreme Court justice to try to stop that course of history. Now, whether he's right is another issue. The overturning of Roe versus Wade, which is what he was most frustrated about, but also he was frustrated about mass shootings, so he decided to go do a mass shooting, or decided to assassinate somebody to stop mass shootings. Doesn't make a lot of sense. But it was his entire purpose was to have a sense of meaning in his own life. And that's actually the biggest problem with demoralization, is that people need a sense of purpose, and they'll do anything to get it. Up to and including some really crazy things like assassinating people. As it is absorbed, consumer culture imposes numerous influences that weaken personality structures, undermine coping, and lay the groundwork for eventual demoralization. Its driving features: individualism, materialism, hypercompetition, greed, overcomplication, overwork, hurriedness, and debt all correlate negatively with psychological health and or social well-being. The level of intimacy, trust, and true friendship in people's lives have plummeted. Sources of wisdom, social and community support, spiritual comfort, intellectual growth, and life education have dried up. Passivity and choice have displaced creativity and mastery. Resilience traits such as patience, restraint, and fortitude have given way to short attention spans, overindulgence, and a masturbatory approach to life. Now, that's a rather stark phrase, the masturbatory approach to life. But is it incorrect? It's hard to disagree with it. Everything seems to be for short-term pleasure right now. We have TikTok videos and Facebook posts and tweets, and everything seems to be short and basically are geared towards instant reaction. Now, is that capitalism's fault? Or is there something bigger going on in society that's driving people to the sense of purposelessness and going to these short attention span type features? The article continues. Research shows that in contrast to earlier times, most people today are unable to identify any sort of philosophy of life or set of guiding principles. Without an existential compass, the commercialized mind gravitates towards a philosophy of futility, as Noam Chomsky calls it, in which people feel naked of power and significance beyond their conditioned role as pliant consumers. Lacking substance and depth and adrift from others and themselves, the thin and fragile consumer self is easily fragmented and dispirited. One of the things that a lot of people talk about these days is the effects of the, falling off of religion in the country. For all the flaws you can find in major religions, they do give people a sense of belonging and community and purpose. And we've, in some ways, stupidly cut that out of our lives without finding a way to replace it. The article continues. By their design, the central organizing principles and practices of consumer culture perpetrate an existential vacuum that is a precursor to demoralization. This inner void is often experienced as a chronic and inescapable boredom, which is not surprising. Despite surface appearances to the contrary, the consumer age is deathly boring. Boredom is caused not because an activity is inherently boring, but because it is not meaningful to the person. Since the life of the consumer revolves around the overkill of meaningless, manufactured, low-level material desires, it is quickly engulfed by boredom as well as jadedness. I don't know what this word is. Ennui and discontent. This steadily graduates to existential boredom, wherein the person finds all of life uninteresting and unrewarding. I think this is a very important point. This is actually one of my main critiques of the public school system, as I talked about back in episode 2, is you're not just not giving people meaning, you're pulling the meaning out of their life. You're making them existentially bored. And bored people do some crazy things. I know it's not popular to talk about anything besides gun control to reduce school shootings, but maybe give some of these young men some purpose in their life and have them not be so freaking bored all the time, and you'd see much better outcomes. Now, obviously, boredom doesn't lead to school shootings, but if you remove all of the purpose from some of these young men's lives and then you make them existentially bored, on the very, very far fringes, some bad things are going to happen. And usually it's self-harm and drug addiction and video games and just withdrawing from society. But sometimes they take that pain outwards and inflict it on the rest of us. Continuing on. Consumption itself is a flawed motivational platform for a society. Repeated consummation of desire without moderating constraints only serves to habituate people and diminish the future satisfaction potential of what is consumed. This develops gradually into consumer anhedonia, wherein consumption loses reward capacity and offers no more than distraction and ritualistic value. Consumerism and psychic deadness are inexorable bedfellows. Individualistic models of mind have stymied our understanding of many disorders that are primarily of cultural origin. But recent years have seen a growing interest in the topic of cultural health and ill health as they impact upon general well-being. At the same time, we are moving away from naive behavioral models and returning to the obvious fact that the human being has a fundamental nature as well as a distinct set of human needs that must be addressed by a cultural blueprint. You know, the purpose of this entire podcast is helping people find more freedom in their own life. But freedom without purpose is not necessarily a good thing. It's going to lead to hedonism and general debauchery. This is why I preach so hard that basically everyone should either work for themselves or be an independent contractor and build their own business up, because having your own business does give you a purpose. It's not enough, it's not sufficient, but it is a start, and you build on your purpose from there. The article continues. In his groundbreaking book, The Moral Order, anthropologist Raoul Narol used the term moral net to indicate the cultural infrastructure that is required for the mental well-being of its members. He used numerous examples to show that entire societies can become predisposed to an array of mental ills if their moral net deteriorates beyond a certain point. To avoid this, a society's moral net must be able to meet the key psycho-social, spiritual needs of its members, including a sense of identity and belonging, cooperative activities that weave people into a community, and shared rituals and beliefs that offer a convincing existential orientation. Similarly, in The Sane Society, Erich Fromm cites the frame of orientation as one of our vital existential needs, but pointed out that today's marketing characters are shackled by a cultural program that actively blocks fulfillment of this and other needs, including the needs for belonging, rootedness, identity, transcendence, and intellectual stimulation. We are living under conditions of cultural insanity, a term referring to a pathological mismatch between the enculturation strategies of a culture and the intrapsychic needs of its followers. Being normal is no longer a healthy ambition. I find that phrase very interesting. I actually don't believe that being normal is a good ambition, but only because the way we've defined normal in the West is so abnormal given historical standards. Why is it normal to work a 9 to 5 meaningless job that you hate? Why is it normal to vote for one of two political parties, both of which support bombing countries that you can't even find on a map? Why is it normal to funnel billions of dollars to a defense contractor industry that promotes violence around the world? Why is any of what we consider mainstream and normal at all worth striving for? If by being normal you mean having stable relationships, a community, and a healthy friend group, then yes, that's something we should strive for. But I think we've just so distorted the idea that most people have in their mind of what normal is that striving for that is not a healthy ambition. Anyway, the article continues. Human culture has mutated into a sociopathic marketing machine dominated by economic priorities and psychological manipulation. Never before has a cultural system inculcated its followers to suppress so much of their humanity. Well, that I agree with. Leading this hostile takeover of the collective psyche are increasingly sophisticated propaganda and misinformation industries that traffic the illusion of consumer happiness by wildly amplifying our expectations of the material world. Now, I would take this out of advertising and into the world of media and politics, because that's a description of how the corporate press pumps up the primary political parties in not just the United States, but if you look at Great Britain or Canada, it's the same thing. They overpromise and they create this unrealistic expectation that you can become happy if the right people are in power, and you can't. Happiness has to come from within yourself. Today's consumers are by far the most propagandized people in history. The relentless and repetitive effect is highly hypnotic, diminishing critical faculties, reducing one's sense of self, and transforming commercial unreality into a surrogate for meaning and purpose. Yeah, again, this is just a straight description of how politics works today. This is why I'm so anti-political. Although, if you tell that to somebody within the system, they'll tell you I'm being political by saying, keep your politics away from me. Anyway, the more lost, disoriented, and spiritually defeated people become, the more susceptible they become to persuasion, and the more they end up buying into the oversold expectations of consumption. But in unreality culture, hyper-inflated expectations continually collide with the reality of experience. Since nothing lives up to the hype, the world of the consumer is actually an ongoing exercise in disappointment. Man, this is nailing the political climate. While most disappointments are minor and easy to dissociate, they accumulate into an emotional background of frustration as deeper human needs get neglected. Continued starvation of these needs fuels disillusion about one's whole approach to life. Over time, people's core assumptions can become unstable. At its heart, demoralization is a generalized loss of credibility in the assumptions that ground our existence and guide our actions. The assumptions underpinning our allegiances to consumerism are especially vulnerable since they are fundamentally dehumanizing. As they unravel, it becomes increasingly difficult to identify with the values, goals, and aspirations that were once part of our consumer reality. The consequent feeling of being forsaken and on the wrong life track is easily mistaken for depression or even unhappiness. But in fact, it is the type of demoralization that most consumer beings will experience to some degree. For the younger generation, the course of boredom, disappointment, disillusion, and demoralization is almost inevitable. As the products of invisible parents, commercialized education, cradle-to-grave marketing, and a profoundly boring and insane cultural program, they must also assimilate into consumer culture while knowing from the outset that its workings are destroying the planet and jeopardizing their future. Understandably, they have become the trance generation, with an insatiable appetite for any technology that can downsize awareness and blunt the emotions. With society in existential crisis and emotional life on a steep downward trajectory, trance is today's fastest growing consumer market. Once our collapsed assumptions give way to demoralization, the problems become how to rebuild the unconscious foundations of our life. In their present forms, the psychology and psychiatric professions are of little use in treating disorders that are rooted in culture and normality. While individual therapy will not begin to heal a demoralized society, to be effective, such approaches must be insight-oriented and focused on the cultural sources of the person's assumptions, identities, values, and centers of meaning. Cultural deprogramming is essential, along with cultural proofing, disobedience training, and character development strategies, all aimed at constructing a worldview that better connects the person to self, others, and the natural world. The real task is somehow to treat a sick culture rather than its sick individuals. Erich Fromm sums up this challenge. We can't make people sane by making them adjust to this society. We need a society that is adjusted to the needs of the people. Fromm's solution included a supreme cultural council that would serve as a cultural overseer and advise on government on corrective and preventative actions. Yeah, I don't like this solution at all. I actually do think the solution is to take control of your own life, to find the purpose and put it in your own life. I don't think that having a government supreme cultural council will help at all. Actually, I think it'll do the opposite. But this is his article, not mine. I'm trying to pull out what's good in it. Anyway, but that sort of solution is still a long way off, as is a science of cultural change. Democracy, in its present guise, is a guardian of cultural insanity. Yeah, democracy is always a guardian of cultural insanity, especially mass democracy. It makes no sense for somebody in urban Los Angeles to be able to vote on how somebody in rural West Virginia lives their life, and vice versa. This is why decentralization is so critical to political survival. But this is about individual survival. This is about finding purpose in your own life. That's what I care about. We are long overdue a cultural revolution that would force a radical revamp of the political process, economics, work, family, and environmental policy. It is true that a society of demoralized people is unlikely to revolt, even though it sits on a massive powder cave of pent-up frustration. But credibility counteracts demoralization, and this frustration can be released with immense energy when a credible cause or credible leadership is added to the equation. It might seem that credibility, meaning, and purposeful action would derive from the multiple threats to our safety and survival posed by the fatal mismatch between consumer culture and the needs of the planet. The fact that it is not highlights the degree of demoralization that infects the consumer age. With infrastructure firmly entrenched and the minimal signs of collective resistance, all signs suggest that our obsolete system, what some call disaster capitalism, will prevail until global catastrophe dictates for us a new cultural direction. So the author here makes some very interesting points. I think he's absolutely spot on that the world is facing a crisis of demoralization and boredom more than actual depression. Also, I think he plays into the demoralization a little bit himself with some of the environmental catastrophizing he does. Now, I'm not saying that there's not climate change happening, just saying that I'm skeptical of some of the more dire predictions and the people claiming it's literally the end of the world. But that's probably not a can of worms worth opening. Anyway, the solution to demoralization is purpose. And it's possible to have purpose in your life. As I said, entrepreneurship can be a purpose for a lot of people. I think one of the mistakes I made early on was the purpose of me being an entrepreneur was to make as much money for myself as possible. And look, money is great, but it will not make you happy. One of the copywriters that I looked up to the most when I was starting out is John Carlton. I spoke with him at this event in Florida a few years ago, and I remember him saying something that had actually a big impact on me. He said, having money only solves the problems that not having money creates. I think that's a very wise insight. Now, I'm definitely pro making a lot of money, but it's not going to make you happy. Also, as John Carlton says, that's a lesson that's best for everyone to learn on their own. But here's what's so cool about being human. The thing that will give you the most happiness as a person, the best feeling of purpose and satisfaction in your life, is actually helping other people. And despite being propagandized to think that it's not possible and your only purpose in life that's possible is to feed the political and corporate machine that's the source of so much of this demoralization, we still have the freedom to help a lot of people and get rich doing it. So that's what you should do. All right, that's all I have for today. I'm back with a great guest next week. My name is Henry Bingaman. Thanks for listening to Getting Out of the Machine.